George, are you
John,
there?
John, hi, how are you?
Good. Merry Christmas Eve.
Yes, Merry Christmas Eve.
And George, I guess this is kind of a sad occasion,
Yeah.
or I don't know, for some people maybe a festive occasion, because it's the last time we will ever record a Science Saturday.
This is the last Science Saturday, and I was trying to remember how long ago was it that this began. It's been a few years.
Yeah, God, it's amazing how long we've been doing it, considering how it started. It didn't seem, well, from my perspective, it didn't seem very promising, actually.
Yeah, so, yeah,
I'm not speaking about you. I just mean, my performance.
Yeah, well, I guess it wasn't all that promising, or this wouldn't be the last one.
Yes,
But not Science Saturday, but Blogging Heads TV as a whole is not disappearing, but kind of going on to shifting down into a lower, slower gear.
Yes, right. As I understand it, Bob is moving up to the big time Atlantic.com,
Yeah.
and
It's great.
and I don't know. He's going to be doing some video there too, but so maybe he'll tap some of the old hands every now and then for God knows what.
Yeah, as I understand it, like if we just decide we want to, chat about science sometime, we can just arrange it informally, and it'll go up on the lower key BHTV website. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, but I'm thinking that we shouldn't do that, because then all those people who have said mean comments about us, well, not you, everybody loves you, over the years, then they'll be sorry. They're really going to miss us, George.
Oh, yeah, somehow I don't, yeah, I'm not too worried about that, but, well, yeah, we'll see if some special occasions might inspire us we'll have to call it something else besides Science Saturday.
Yeah. And in the meantime, who knows, maybe this will be like Oprah's last show, and we're going to get tremendous ratings for this valedictory show here, and it'll be the outpouring of emotion and love will be so enormous that we're just going to have to go back and do this again soon.
Maybe. Yeah. I guess the way these things usually go, we should be having clips from great moments in past shows, but of course we're not doing that.
Hell no, that's for the IT guys. We just the beauty of this is that all you and I have to do is sit here and shoot the shit. Turn the computer on, plug in the cell phone, and yammer away for an hour. And
well, I was thinking of back to maybe after we'd been doing it about a year or so, when we were getting really ambitious, and I was doing a segment toward the end called Garage Band Science.
Oh, that was great.
Remember that?
Yes.
My giant spark coil shooting sparks and other kinds of things from my Frankenstein laboratory. So, maybe we can revive something and call it Garage Band Science.
That's a great idea. Everybody loved that. I loved it, even though, the problem was I couldn't see what you were...
Right, yes, we'd have to figure out a different way to do it. Actually, back at that time, I liked the term GarageBand Science so much that I ended up registering the URL in case we ever want to use it. Right
George,
now it doesn't point to anything. So yeah, maybe we'll do something called GarageBand Science. It will be a mix of that and a mix of talking about the latest science news.
George, that I think points up a paradox. On the one hand, you come across as this kind of, I think sort of a traditionalist in some ways who is skeptical of the newfangled, and yet registering a name like GarageBand Science, very media savvy, my friend.
GarageBandScience.com. Well, yeah, actually I run my own web server, my own mail server on my computer.
Wow.
Here in Santa Fe, and I have my whole house wired for Ethernet, and I put in the wiring myself, the so-called physical layer. So I was right up on the cutting edge until all this social media junk started, which I just can't can't seem to take to.
You know, I think you will be one of those people who you never get into it, and then you're going to look really hip and prescient when it all collapses, when Facebook, when everybody migrates in droves away from Facebook because it's seen as completely uncool in a year or so.
Yeah, there was that funny article in the Times within the last week or so where they were interviewing actually young people, and they were who either had spurned Facebook from the start or turned away from it because they decided it was ridiculous, and if they wanted to hear what their friends were doing on vacations, they'd rather get a personal email from them or a phone call or maybe meet up with them later and talk about it instead of this thing where you broadcast to 756 of your closest friends everything that you're doing.
Yeah, I think I might have read that, and there was a comment from one guy who said, I joined Facebook, and then I started hearing from these people that I hadn't seen or talked to in many, many years, and then I remembered once again why I hadn't seen them or spoken to them in many, many years.
That's beautiful.
Yeah.
Well, I also don't have a Kindle or read on any other electronic reading device, but I don't know. I may succumb to that at some point. I'm certainly the wave of the future, I'm afraid.
I am sorely tempted. As you know, my computer might actually. This is my main laptop that I'm using for recording this chat, and it's been acting up lately. This is something that was given to me by my school, and it started repeatedly crashing. So I need a new computer, and I really don't know what to get. I looked at the iPad recently, and it's really friggin' cool, but
yeah.
But I don't know. I don't know what.
Depends on how much you want a physical keyboard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm pretty clumsy. I got big knobby fingers, so.
Yeah, I'm really bad at those little keyboards too. Look at the MacBook Airs. They weigh like a little over 2 pounds, and in some ways it's like having an iPad, except it's an actual computer.
Do you have one?
Yeah, I got one earlier this year when my old PowerBook finally went out, and I had to go on a trip. So I really like it. I mean, you trade off screen space and basically just screen space and a little bit of power. Not I don't know. Most of these machines have far more power than anyone needs unless you do a lot of video work. But I like it because it's very, very lightweight.
How much does that cost, if I dare ask?
I think they're around $1,000 to $1,200, depending
Jesus,
on.
That's pretty cheap.
Yeah, they're really nice little machines.
Oh, I know. Some people don't like them because they don't play CDs.
But I never really miss that because all the software you get now is usually something you download. And they give you the operating system comes on one of those little USB sticks, so if you ever needed to reload your operating system, you do it from that.
Here's another irony, George. If we'd been talking tech talk like this from the beginning, we might have had the kind of numbers.
Yeah, that's true.
That kept blogging heads alive.
Tech talk. Yeah, talking tech or teching heads. That's it. Teching heads. Techingheads.com. But talking about rejecting like modern technology and maybe being proved prescient in the end. That just reminded me, I was up at the Santa Fe Institute last week talking to some people, and I ran into Cormac McCarthy,
Wow.
The author. And Cormac McCarthy has an office he's like the writer in residence at the Santa Fe Institute.
I actually met him at a reception that you were at as well.
Yeah.
Back in the, 95 or so. He was there,
that's around the time I first met him. He's been hanging out he was hanging out in Santa Fe then because he's a friend of Murray Gell-Mann's, the physicist.
What I remember is just that he looked very gloomy.
He's really not. Actually, the upshot of all this is I had breakfast with him yesterday.
Oh, that's so cool.
It was interesting because we'd been talking about doing that, every time we see each other, and because he was very interested in my biography of Murray, since Murray's, been a friend of his for a long time, and he was. What all this reminded me of is the story about his manual typewriter. He had an old mechanical typewriter that he used for years and years, going way back to his early novels, and finally a couple of years ago it wore out, and he was going to get a new mechanical typewriter, not a word processor, and John Miller, who is someone we both know, who's an economist from Carnegie Mellon, who also has a very strong connection with the Santa Fe Institute, was around, and he suggested that they auction the typewriter and give the proceeds to the Santa Fe Institute. And they thought maybe they'd get a few $1,000s, and it auctioned off for $250,000.
Oh, Jesus Christ!
And all the money.
Me?
No, someone paid $250,000 for it, and all the money went to the Santa Fe Institute.
What happened to the recession? People have that kind of cash to throw around?
Well, that's how it's always been. There's been that upper crust that are.
Jesus Christ!
The recession was.
It's funny. I remember that wonderful conference on the limits of science at the Santa Fe Institute that we both went to, and one of the things I remember is that they, first of all, the whole thing was catered so well, but we went to somebody's house at one point, and it was this amazing kind of like Southwest.
Oh yeah, whose
modernist.
house was that?
Yeah, and it had this beautiful organic garden, and obviously this was somebody with way too much money.
Well, but maybe a scientist,
Yeah, or
maybe
a
not.
patron.
It might have been a patron. Yeah. Well, there's this whole interesting thing in Santa Fe that's starting to develop, this kind of quasi-science / celebrity thing, because they have this thing called they have this thing called the Miller Scholarship now or the Miller Fellowship or something at the Santa Fe Institute, and they bring in different people, and that's Dan Dennett was there on this Miller thing, and you come there for a few months, but recently they've been getting more unlikely or less likely people like Sam Shepard.
Wow. Did you get to meet all these people when they come through?
If I want to, yeah. I mean, I did meet Sam Shepard just briefly. We were talking at some reception, and he was talking about how he was going to buy a house in Arroyo Hondo, and he and Jessica Lange lived in Santa Fe early on in their careers, and he's writing a screenplay now, so he has an office at the Santa Fe Institute.
Jesus.
And then Cormac McCarthy has an office. I mean, or half an office. It's more like a desk, and now Valerie Plame is there and actually works in like communications and outreach.
Yes, the renegade CIA agent.
Yeah, so it's really something. You go to a Santa Fe Institute event, and there'll be people like Murray Gell-Mann and Seth Lloyd and various physicist friends and economists, Stone Farmer, econophysicists, and then you might see Sam Shepard, Cormac McCarthy, and Valerie Plame.
Oh my God! What a fantastic party selection that is. God, I'm just dying with envy, George. That almost sounds like the old. I thought that Santa Fe Institute had made a deliberate decision to get kind of boring because they felt that they were seen as too glitzy and too much fizzle or sizzle or not enough meat. But I think sizzle is better for them. And certainly better for somebody like you.
It's definitely, I mean, not that I have more than minimal interaction with any of the celebrities, but it's kind of a nice weird thing about Santa Fe among many others.
Can I just ask you, you find yourself standing next to Sam Shepard, what do you talk about?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Actually, I remember specifically because, it was a little awkward, but he mentioned that he was about to make an offer on this house that I mentioned, and then he was really worried because it had flunked his radon test. And I wish
I'd been there because I could have told them that radon testing is a big scam. There's nothing to worry about.
Well, I tell them a milder version of that I basically have a section in my book that I'm writing, the Cancer Chronicles, in which I start reflecting on all, the things that you can worry about, when someone you know or yourself maybe gets cancer. And during all this, I took a radon test in the office I was using downstairs, and it was just like through the roof.
Right.
Way off the scale. And then I started reading all the, first I went to the EPA chart, and looked at what they considered different levels and what this actually means. So, it's something where it raises your chances of getting lung cancer, it's a very tiny percentage, fraction of a percentage. I can't remember the numbers, but of course then you compare it to, that's for non-smokers, and then you compare it to the rate for smokers, and it's tiny fraction, of course, of the risk of smoking cigarettes. But then I looked further at the original studies where they came up with these numbers, and they're based on your underground uranium miners.
Right. Many of whom were smokers.
Right, and statistically, they tried to allow for that fact that a lot of them were smokers and had other risk factors, but still there's this question of whether you can take huge exposures of radon gas like that and then extrapolate a certain lung cancer rate and hopefully adjust for the smoking factor, and then whether you can say, well, if you're getting a tiny fraction of that amount, is it a linear relationship, and then you're going to get a tiny fraction of the same number of lung cancer cases. And of course that's the big question, if there's a threshold.
Yeah, what I remember about radon was, it goes back to when I bought my house in Garrison in the early 90s, and radon testing was just becoming popular then, and we had our house tested, and it tested very high, and I actually used that as leverage to get the price down.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, I decided to do some research on it. I wrote an article about it for Scientific American, and what I learned was that the Reagan administration wanted to look like it. Actually, this would have been it started under the Bush administration, the first Bush administration. It wanted to act like it gave a shit about the environment. And so there are some people in the EPA who just seized on the radon issue, and it actually had been based on these studies that went way back of the uranium miners, and the studies were really flawed, as you say. And there were some studies that even showed that low levels of radon, people who were exposed had lower levels of lung cancer.
Oh yeah, there was a protective effect.
Yeah, I mean,
Right.
So I just decided that it was basically bullshit. But meanwhile, this big industry had sprung up that was trying to scare the hell out of people about the effects of radon.
Yeah.
I just have to tell you, if I had been standing next to Sam Shepard, what I would have said to him is, I've been watching American Horror Story, and your wife is so scary in that. She is like one crazy bitch.
is that Jessica Lange is on that?
Yes.
Oh. They're apparently. I heard they're getting divorced.
Oh, I'm sorry to hear that.
Yeah, I may be wrong, so I shouldn't have said that. But wow. Well, I did. I mean, my advice was basically that shouldn't keep you from buying the house.
Right.
But even better advice would be that, leave it at that. But
yeah,
it's not totally. I mean, in an ideal world, if you can reduce all these little tiny micro risks, as many of them as you can without going to a huge amount of trouble or expense, there's no reason not to.
Well, what I remember, we've talked about this before when we were talking about nuclear power, and when I suddenly went from being an irrational opponent to, maybe an irrational proponent. One of the studies that really stuck out in my mind is that you can chart natural variations in background radiation especially from radon around the world, and there is no correlation with a rise and fall of lung cancer rates or cancer rates in general. And there's a place in Iran that has ridiculously high background radiation, much, much higher than would be allowed in any nuclear power plant. And people there don't get cancer any more than people elsewhere in the world.
And this is this like includes cosmic rays and other things coming either from the Earth or radon or particle emissions from rocks. And
that's true. So some of these places are high altitude, like Santa Fe, for example.
Yeah. Now we do, like New Mexico does have a higher than normal rate of melanoma.
Huh.
And but of course that's direct solar exposure, which is not, that's not controversial. That you're getting the very closest star to the planet, and the higher you are, the less atmosphere there is shielding out the ultraviolet rays.
Also, a very outdoorsy population.
Outdoorsy population, and so that makes skin cancer rates, at least among lighter skinned people, very, very high here. And not very, very high, but higher than normal. But that's different from the effect of like the background radiation. Usually when they say that, they're talking about cosmic rays or radon and just radioactive emissions from the Earth and sky, but not the sun, because the sun, that's a powerful source of UV and gamma radiation.
Right. The sun, bringer of life and bringer of death.
Yeah. Well, we need that radiation too, presumably to help keep the random mutation generator going. So. Right.
Yes. Where would we be without that random mutation?
Yeah.
We'd still be pond scum.
Yeah, that's true. We'd be stuck in a little cul-de-sac if we evolved at all. So, I guess there'd be other things that would cause random mutations, but that's presumably a generator, big generator.
As long as we're talking about physics, you have any thoughts about the Higgs boson?
Oh, yeah. I remember you said you wrote something about that, and I read, Dennis Overby had a piece in the Times, I guess a couple of pieces, showing that they had, they had strong enough hints of a blip that people were getting fairly excited, and Brian Greene even wrote an op-ed piece. Did you see that?
Yes, I saw all the coverage.
Let me see what he said. There was some line in here that struck me. He said, he experienced his first physics-generated thrill. No, I experienced my first physics-generated chill in a decade. Just the feeling that they might find the Higgs. And I thought that kind of epitomized the situation in high-energy physics really well, that, it's been at least 10 years since they've really been able to advance experimentally beyond what's predicted in the standard model and the other theories. And, the big missing linchpin is the Higgs boson. And, they didn't find it at Fermilab, and the hope was with the higher energies at the new accelerator in Geneva at CERN that they would finally be able to produce for, a tiny fraction of an instant, positive identification of the Higgs. And now, as it says in the article, it could still turn out to be a statistical fluke, but I guess it's the most encouraging that they've come up with so far. Now, I didn't get a chance yet to read the piece that you wrote. Was that in your Scientific American column?
Yeah, I wasn't going to comment on the Higgs because I try to avoid doing my cranky end of science shtick too much. But then it was just like, oh, for God's sake, enough is enough. One op-ed piece about the glories of the Higgs and the LHC after another, and I think it's actually telling that Brian Greene says this is his biggest thrill in 10 years because that's not much. And they didn't see the Higgs. They think they might have seen the Higgs. A tantalizing hint, as some people
tantalizing hint, but they never actually see these things in any kind of familiar sense. I mean, basically, you'll have a theory that predicts that a certain particle at a certain energy. So basically, you're slamming together these two proton beams, and producing particles at a certain energy. And then you'll have a theory that says if the Higgs exists, it will have certain characteristics, and the characteristics are basically, that it decays into photons or electrons that behave in a certain manner, and because that's all you can really directly detect are photons and electrons, light and electricity, and everything else is kind of, inferred backwards from that.
Yeah, but there are different degrees of circumstantial evidence, and circumstantial evidence for, the top quark or different variants of the neutrino are really, really strong circumstantial evidence.
Yeah.
So
and then they were found by more than one detector.
Yeah, and you can say
two
C
detectors
without necessarily having to use air quotes all the time. But so they are getting something around the margins of statistical significance for the Higgs. But here's the problem I have with the Higgs. It seems sort of anticlimactic in the same sense that discovering the top quark which was, I don't know, like the mid-90s or so, and it was sort of the last piece of quantum chromodynamics that was missing, and they found it, but it was such a foregone conclusion that I really didn't find it very dramatic. I guess I was already becoming disillusioned with particle physics back then. But one of the points that I make about the Higgs is that it's always been kind of this is one of the points I make in my Scientific American piece. It's always been kind of an ambiguous marketing tool for particle physics. So you remember the Higgs was called the God particle by Leon Letterman.
Yeah, right. And his book was called The God Particle about the Higgs,
which is just shameless. I mean, Letterman.
Yeah, but in the book, he says this with perfectly characteristic Leon Lederman irony. You don't, like, anyone who read the book wouldn't think that this had anything to do with theology or. It was obviously tongue-in-cheek, and yet, of course, people don't read the book. It gets skimmed off, and now all these news stories talk about the God particle, and so there's a definite hype to it. But I think you could argue that the reason for the hype is that it's such an important, it's the important missing piece of the Standard Model, which is our basic framework for explaining the physical world.
It confers mass on the other known particles. Okay, that's pretty important. But
because basically, otherwise you have every particle. It's as though the masses were just assigned randomly by someone, throwing darts at a dartboard and says, well, the electron will weigh this much and the proton will weigh 1,700 times more, or whatever the ratio is, and that the neutron will, be almost exactly the same as the proton, but not quite. And, all of this stuff is just arbitrary parameters that you have to plug into the Standard Model. And with the Higgs, you'd be able to describe this field that would give these particles their masses. So it'd be very exciting to be able to remove all these arbitrary parameters from the model.
Okay, here's the problem. If the Higgs is the God particle, what is a string? It's
not the God particle. The mass particle.
What is a string? What is, so how do you've already, what hyperbole can you come up with to sell particle physics if you've already used the God particle? The problem with experimental particle physics for the past at least 30 years has been that the theorists are talking about really amazing shit that basically has little or nothing to do with what's going on with experimental particle physics and the kinds of things that they can detect at Fermilab or the LHC or even at the old superconducting super collider, which was canceled back in 1993.
You're talking about superstring theory, but not necessarily the Higgs or not necessarily so-called supersymmetric particles, because some of those are predicted to be reachable with the energies of the LHC, right?
Yes, they were predicted at much lower. I mean, the Fermilab thought that that it could predict supersymmetric particles.
Oh,
you see
yeah,
what I'm
well,
saying, though,
yeah, the
George?
Higgs too. I remember writing a story in the big years ago for Science Times, and the big headline was that they did not, once again, Fermilab did not, find the Higgs particle. But of course, the way the positive spin on that is that you've ruled out the energy. So it doesn't exist at this energy or below. And then, of course, the question I kind of raised in the article was, how long can you keep doing this?
Right.
Like every time you don't find it, you say, well, this exists at a higher energy and a higher energy. But from reading Green's piece, there's apparently a very good theoretical foundation for believing that. Not just believing that it exists at these energies because it hasn't been found at the lower energies, but that there's good theoretical reasons for thinking that it might be found within a certain range that's LHC reachable. So
okay.
So that's like totally
okay, but
legitimate science.
Okay, but the problem is that all the glamour in physics now really comes from unification. From string theory, from loop space theory, from the possibility of extra dimensions, from the landscape of multiverse theory.
Well, that's all, which seems to be beyond experiment.
All that stuff that comes out of unified theories, quantum gravity theories, and all that sort of thing, particle physics fused with cosmology, possibly telling us how the universe came into being, whether or not inflation really happened. Inflation, this tremendous explosive burst of expansion in the very early universe that some theorists believe happened, even though there's absolutely no real hard evidence for it. So the Higgs boson is so like retro in some ways. It really does go back to the time when they were sort of finding one quark after another and confirming the standard model in kind of a boring way. And meanwhile, the theorists were just going off into la la land. And the problem is that the experiments don't come remotely close because the unification takes place at these scales. It is so far beyond what the LHC can access that it's inconceivable that we will have the kind of circumstantial evidence for strings and some of these other things that we have now for quarks and neutrinos and so forth.
Well, or for the Higgs. From everything you said, that's the great thing about the Higgs is that it's this retro in the sense that this is old-fashioned particle physics where the theorists predict a particle that's going to show certain secondary characteristics when it's created in a particle accelerator for a very brief instant, and then they're looking for evidence of that, and there's good theoretical reasons to believe it might be achievable with the energies that we can create here on Earth with the LHC. So that's very exciting. And if there's a few other like supersymmetric particles and things like this would all be this kind of retro physics, but it's it's the old paradigm or the old procedure where the theory works two ways. Originally experimenters would find these particles like in weird things in cosmic rays when they sent up balloons with film cameras in them, and then the theorists would try to explain what the hell is that, and like the muons that were discovered that way. And
who ordered that?
Who ordered that? Yeah, that was Ravi, right? II Ravi when the
right at Columbia.
Yeah, when the particle track that didn't make any sense, or when they saw the positron in the cloud chamber, and then the theorists would explain it, and then it kind of moved beyond where the theorists were positing particles that came out of their equations, and then the experimenters would find them or not. And the Higgs is very much still within that tradition. But then, the big criticism of superstring theory is you have the theorists predicting things that really cannot conceivably be created at energies anywhere close to what we can generate on Earth. Or the old thing about you'd have to have a particle accelerator the size of the galaxy or some hyperbole like that. But
let me ask you this, George. In this piece for Scientific American, I mentioned a bet that I had with Michio Kaku that's almost 10 years old now, and we put up serious money, a couple $1,000 on about unification theories.
mm-hmm.
Do you think that by the year 2020, a Nobel Prize will be awarded for work in a unified theory?
In a unified theory, I mean, not just saying a really like a really complete standard model that included the Higgs, but
no, I mean, God, I hope we will have that quite soon.
or even supersymmetry, but something that would actually unify gravity with the other three forces in a consistent framework.
Yeah.
To the extent that my opinion matters, I'd be pretty dubious, because it just seems to me that I don't know. I mean, the theories will come out, but unless they find some totally new idea that would lead to a way to test them,
right?
Or you have to accept the idea of the landscape. The notion that there's an infinite or near infinite number of different parallel universes, each with a different law of physics, and we just happen to be in a certain one. And if you can, unless you can come up with some a priori reason to say why we're in this particular universe, then it just seems to me like metaphysics.
Mathematical theology.
Mathematical theology, metaphysics, because I guess the old-fashioned idea still appeals to me that you have to make predictions that are falsifiable.
Yeah, I actually.
We're among the paparazzi.
I think, and I probably am trying to say that I'm sounding more gleeful about this than I really am. But I think the LHC is. I think we're seeing the beginning of the end of particle physics finally, and that you're just not going to get. There will always be people who are pursuing unification theories, but you're not going to get the kind of really smart, ambitious people pursuing this branch of science that you get now.
I don't know, but there's just such an intellectual appeal to it, and then so many people have argued just all the the amazing mathematics that's come out of it, if nothing else, and even if you don't get to the point where you can make testable predictions, it can deepen your insight of physics in other ways. So I think it's always going to attract some just really brilliant people that just are driven to want to get to the very foundations of how we explain this weird world we find ourselves in.
Yeah, like you still get brilliant people, I think, who are studying Shakespeare or Plato or Lucretius or people like that.
Well, this is what you would call ironic science, right?
Yeah.
Using a term from your book, but I hope it continues. I still think it's a wonderful sign of civilization that people are employed to do these things.
I do. I hope it continues too. I love ironic science. Ironic science is just more fun than real science quite often.
Yeah. Well, maybe we should get into something that would be closer to the definition of real science. I was reminded of Dennis Overby's piece about 2 Earth-sized planets are discovered.
Yeah, I saw
in
that.
our galaxy, which, as he notes, doubles the number of Earth-sized planets in our galaxy from 2, Earth and Venus, to 4, including these 2 others. But, again, I was, of course, now there's how many planets? Originally, when they first found the first sign of just another planet, it was such a huge thing.
And there are a bunch of false positives.
Positives. And then
this field goes back to the 70s at least.
Yeah.
And, it's always been pushing the limits of instrumentation. And so there are a bunch of claims that there always had to be quite large planets had been discovered, and then they were overturned, and then a new claim. And so, early on the field was very suspect, and now it's just been this deluge of real confirmed sightings.
Well, yeah, just the data from the Kepler project, the Kepler spacecraft. I'm just reading has found 2,326 potential planets.
Jesus, I didn't realize it was that much.
207 of which would be Earth size. And when this first started, I was a little bothered by the fact of what counted as discovering one of these planets. So basically, they would detect, from the spectrum of light put out by, this tiny dot of light that we assume is a star, that variations in the spectrum showed that it was wobbling.
Yes.
And wobbling in a certain way that you could explain if a planet of a certain mass was orbiting it at a certain speed, at a certain distance, and you could use Kepler's laws to figure out the most likely candidate. And, very fascinating, but, kind of, tantalizing, but very indirect. And then they've been finding, much more, they've been having closer, more direct kind of observations where they'll actually see the blink of a star that's presumably being rhythmically occluded by a planet going in front of it. And
yeah.
And but again, I was reading with the latest. Let's see. Just this paragraph in Dennis's story reminded me that a lot of this of detecting planets so far away is not a whole lot more indirect and resulting in statistical analysis than detecting subatomic particles. So it says confirmation of a planet requires additional observations, usually if its star wobbles as it gets tugged by the planet going around. The gravitational pull of planets as small as the Earth on their parent star is too small to measure with current spectrographs, so the astronomers resorted to a statistical method called Blender, B-L-E-N-D-E-R, in which millions of computer simulations of background stars try to mimic the Kepler signal. They concluded that Kepler 20e was 3,400 times more likely to be a planet than background noise, with the odds in favor of Kepler 20f being real were 1370 to 1.
Oh my God, George, that sounds like it's right in your sweet spot of
it's
circumstantial scientific evidence. That
what counts as an observation?
Yeah, it reminds me of that piece you did, I think, on the Hubble constant, was it? Or basically, trying to calculate the age of the universe and how it's this gigantic structure of evidence built upon evidence.
It's a network of assumptions, and and
that's why you had estimates off by a factor of 2. I think for maybe political reasons, astronomers have all agreed to agree on a single age of the universe now.
Well, this actually goes way back to Hubble and the first use of the Cepheid variables to predict predict galactic distances, and then it turns out that they came up with reasons to think that the calculations were off by a factor of 2, so it was as though the size of the universe doubled overnight, and just using that to make the point of how little we can observe directly. I think the term I used in my book, Fire in the Mind, was that we're basically celestial couch potatoes, and we're just sitting here on Earth and just extrapolating from these few little photons that come our way, and that all the assumptions you have to make and the great leaps to come up with, with these grand cosmological theories, which, it's a wonderful thing because you do these theories and then different theories cross-check them, and then, what starts out seeming like a house of cards starts to seem more and more solid, and yet, the wonderful thing about science is that it's always tentative like that.
Well, except there was a bizarre period in the late 80s and early 90s. I remember doing an article for Scientific American on the debate over the Hubble constant, the age of the universe, rate of expansion of the universe, and it had split into these two political camps.
Oh, right.
And I think it was the Alan Sandage camp, this curmudgeonly old cosmologist that Dennis Overby wonderfully profiled in his book Lonely Hearts of the cosmos.
Right.
As I recall, he defended a quite old age of the universe, 17 or 18.
Older and larger.
Yeah, 17 or 18
up
billion years. And you had some other people who were going with a figure of only, Jesus, I don't know, 7 or 8 billion years.
Yeah.
And it was almost like the Sunnis and the Shiites. It got so personal with the catfighting between the two different sides. But you don't hear about that anymore. So I assume that some of those problems have been resolved.
Yeah, I mean, the figure you hear now is 13.7 billion light years in diameter, and therefore not diameter, radius, and therefore 13.7 billion years old. And I can't remember how they came upon that, but I guess to me the remarkable thing would be to think you could even have the right order of magnitude.
Well, the remarkable thing to me is that they've got
much less arguable
over
whether it's 6 billion or 16 billion or.
Yeah, I'm a little suspicious about the decimal point. Given what I know about the history of that whole area of cosmology.
Yeah, it's probably not good to think of any of this stuff as too precise. It just gives you a really good order of magnitude sense of size and age. And and just amazing that we're able to come up with a coherent argument for that being the case. Mm-hmm. Coherent mathematical argument based on observation, and yet, like anything else, still falsifiable because it's based, even though it's not controlled experiment where you can repeat the Big Bang and tweak the variables. It's based on observations of different phenomena that are all seem to be consistent with that number or magnitude of number.
So, are you up for something completely different, although also
totally.
Somewhat ethereal? Okay. I'm holding up now galleys of a really strange, interesting book called The Folly of Fools. The subtitle is The Logic of Deceit and Self-Deception in Human Life. And it's by a legendary evolutionary theorist named Robert Trivers. Who you've heard of Trivers, right?
Yeah. Remind me though.
Okay, Trivers is. There are some people who say that he is the most original Darwinian theorist of the last half century. I'm sure you could. That's it's very arguable, but he's certainly in this very elite group. He was responsible for a few key ideas that were then expanded upon by people like Richard Dawkins and Edward Wilson, Steve Pinker. Bob Wright talked a lot about Robert Trivers' work in The Moral Animal. One of his coolest ideas is basically, it's called reciprocal altruism. And the basic idea of it is that all our so-called moral acts are acts of generosity and compassion toward each other. The classic example would be the Good Samaritan helping a total stranger that he finds beaten and helpless on the road. That those all stem from a very selfish gene Darwinian process. That Trivers' idea was that the reason we're sometimes nice to each other, not nice to people with whom we share genes, blood relatives, but to others, to non-relatives, is that over very long periods of evolutionary time, and in the aggregate, statistically, there would be a slight net benefit to helping others. That the Good Samaritan, or all the Good Samaritans, in some, would get a net benefit by helping others in terms of enhanced prestige. Maybe the person they help gives them something back in return, all those sorts of things. Yeah. And so we have these emotions that come out in us now and then, manifested as empathy, compassion, wanting to help others that stem from an essentially selfish process at the core. It's just a wonderfully bracing idea about human nature. Trivers also pointed out that because people in a family, a husband and wife, for example, two mates, don't share any genes with each other, and their offspring only share half their genes with each other, that you should get a lot of conflict within a family, as well as acts of generosity and altruism. And so it explains some of the conflicted emotions that people feel in families. I think of it as a kind of Freudian theory of family dynamics, except put in Darwinian terms. It was really brilliant. The thing about Trivers that's interesting is that he has struggled with, and he's been public about this, with bipolar disorder since his late teens, I think. He was at Harvard as an undergraduate. And he's also an irascible, very curmudgeonly person who has a hard time with authority figures. And so his career hasn't gone as smoothly as it might have. And he's never really written a big popular book the way some of these other folks have. And he's not very well known, not nearly as well known as he should be. But he has finally written this popular book about something that has long interested him, which is deceit, and not just how we all deceive each other, but how we often deceive ourselves. And he comes up with Darwinian explanations for why that should be so. And it's really a fascinating read.
Wow, it sounds great. What's the title again?
It's called The Folly of Fools. And I forget if I mentioned that I reviewed this for the New York Times Book Review, and my review will be coming out on Christmas Day, actually.
Oh, great. We'll watch for that.
Yeah.
Wow, that sounds fascinating.
Yeah, and one of the interesting things about the book is that it kind of veers from discussions of studies of deceit by humans, and even deceit in the other examples of deceit in the animal kingdom, and then suddenly Trivers reveals cases of deceit and self-deceit in his own life, and he's really hard on himself sometimes. He talks about examples in which he deceived his two ex-wives, he deceived girlfriends. Apparently he's been very active with the ladies through his life. He's deceived his children. I think he has 5 children in all. He's had very conflicted relations with colleagues, and so he's brutal on humans in general, but also brutal on himself, which again makes it kind of an interesting read.
And all this is woven into the book.
Pardon me?
And this is all woven into the book, so it's kind of... Wow, that sounds like a fascinating and unusual, as you said, book.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
I'll be interested in reading what your take was in the book review, unless you want to give us a preview.
Well, that basically was my preview.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, but
well, I'll just tell you a story. This is how I begin my review. I was at the Human Behavior and Evolution meeting. It has a big annual meeting, and in, I think it was 1995, it was held at the University of California at Santa Barbara, which is like a hotbed of evolutionary psychology. There's this husband and wife team, Cosmides and Tubi, who are there. Napoleon Chagnon was also, I think he was at San Diego, but in the same general area. And all the big stars of evolutionary thinking about human nature were at this conference. Richard Dawkins was also there. Bob Wright was there. And I remember I was just sort of wandering around outside the conference hall at one point, and I saw this collection of kind of disreputable characters, and one of them was this guy with a scruffy beard, and he's wearing this kind of weird woven hat, and he and these other people were smoking a joint. And I was curious about this guy, and I asked somebody who that was, and I learned that it was it was Robert Trivers.
Oh.
We never actually gave a talk. And the reason I can talk about him smoking pot is because he very freely confesses to being a pothead in
his book. Ah.
Yeah.
Okay, so you're off the hook on that one.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow. Well, this sounds like a really interesting piece of work.
Oh, and one other thing I'll mention. That Trivers, one of the raps against, so Stephen Jay Gould and some of the early critics of evolutionary thinking about human nature are often associated with Nazis and odious right-wingers in general. And certainly there are some right-wing racist types who are attracted to Darwinian and genetic theories in general. But Trivers himself is, if anything, I would say you'd have to say he's extremely anti-authoritarian, maybe far left. One of his best friends was the Black Panther Huey Newton.
Wow.
So he is not exactly a conservative Republican.
No, I mean that was such a false, false accusation. I mean the people who were doing this were just pursuing these very interesting scientific explanations, trying to extend what you could explain using the neo-Darwinian framework. But yeah. I mean, look at E.O. Wilson.
Right.
Yeah. Well, this sounds like a good review and a good book.
Yeah. Well, it was fun. It was a fun book to read, and actually, it was. I enjoyed writing the review as well. So.
Yeah.
So listen, George. I don't know. Should we?
My computer has an hour. Yeah.
My
maybe
computer
we
crashed.
should. Yeah. What were you going to say?
I was going to say maybe we should wrap it up. We're almost at an hour.
Yeah, I think so. So we might as well keep to the originally allotted time and not run over since this is our swan song here.
Right. And who the hell is going to be watching on Christmas Eve anyway?
Yeah, I wouldn't think a whole lot of people, but
always fun to talk to you though, George.
Yeah, same to you. So we'll continue it one way or the other.
Yes, definitely. So Merry Christmas to you and all your loved ones, and I guess I'll be talking to you in the new year.
Indeed. Merry Christmas.
All right. Bye, George.
Okay. Bye.